I woke up that morning with a metallic taste in my mouth and a strange feeling that my memories of yesterday weren't entirely my own. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a small scar behind my ear that definitely wasn't there before. And then I found a note in my own handwriting with an address and a meeting time I had no memory of. And the most terrifying part was a single phrase I had written to myself. They are already inside all of us. A month ago, I was just an ordinary programmer at an ordinary company that developed translation systems for humanity's new intergalactic partners. After the first contact with aliens 3 years ago, the world changed drastically. The Skelecons, as the press called them, looked like 2-meter-tall skeletons covered in translucent skin. At first, everyone was terrified of their appearance, but they turned out to be surprisingly peaceful and technologically advanced. My job consisted of configuring the algorithms for their holographic translators. The Skelecons communicated through bioelectric impulses, while we used sounds, so complex systems were needed for mutual understanding. I often worked late, studying their language patterns and trying to understand the logic of their thinking. It all started with little things. Colleagues began to act strangely. First, Mark from the next department started avoiding me in the hallways. Then Anna from accounting began to look at me as if I owed her something. And our boss, David, stopped talking to me altogether and communicated only through email. I thought it was just typical office politics until I noticed they were all wearing identical silver bracelets. When I asked Mark where he bought such a beautiful item, he said it was a gift from the Skelecons for participating in a cultural exchange program. I found it strange that I hadn't been invited to this program. The first suspicions arose when I was working on a new project to improve the holographic interfaces. I found hidden functions in the code that no one had documented. These functions collected users' biometric data: heart rate, blood pressure, and brain electrical activity. Officially, this was for better translator calibration, but why collect such a vast amount of information? I decided to dig deeper and access the company's servers through a backdoor I had left for myself on my first day of work. What I saw there made my blood run cold. Our company was just one of hundreds around the world collecting detailed data on human consciousness. The files had names like neural activity samples, emotional response patterns, and memory maps. Inside were terabytes of information on how the human brain works. But the most horrifying thing was that all this data was being sent directly to the Skelecon ships in Earth's orbit. I realized I had witnessed something terrible. The aliens weren't just studying our culture, they were mapping our consciousness. Every time a person used their translators or other technologies, they received a slice of their mind. The next day, I tried to talk to Mark. He listened to my concerns and said I was being paranoid. According to him, the Skelecons were helping humanity develop, and data collection was standard practice for improving their technology. He suggested I meet with representatives of the cultural program to see their good intentions for myself. The meeting was scheduled at our company's office on a Saturday evening. Mark said that a Skelecon representative would personally explain the nature of their research to me. I agreed, but I decided to play it safe and copied all the files I had found onto an external drive. On Saturday at the office, I was met by a tall Skelecon with a translator on its chest. Its translucent skin shimmered with a bluish light, and 2 bright lights burned in its eye sockets. It introduced itself as researcher Zeth Kaur and said it wanted to dispel my doubts. Zeth Kaur explained that their race studies various forms of consciousness throughout the galaxy. According to it, the human mind is unique in its capacity for creativity and emotional depth. They had no intention of harming people. On the contrary, they wanted to help us evolve. It showed me a hologram of their home planet. It was a world of crystal and light, where billions of Skelecons lived in perfect harmony, connected by a single neural network. They had no wars, diseases, or suffering because all thoughts and emotions were shared among all members of society. Zeth Kaur said they wanted to offer the same future to humanity. The collected data would allow them to create a technology that would connect all human minds into a single network of consciousness. There would be no more loneliness, misunderstanding, or conflict. Each person would feel what everyone else felt. It sounded tempting, but something bothered me. I asked what would happen to individuality, the right to privacy, and one's own thoughts. Zeth Kaur replied that these were primitive concepts that humans would have to abandon for a higher form of existence. Then I understood that the Skelecons didn't see us as equal partners. To them, we were interesting animals that could be studied and then improved, according to their ideas of perfection. They sincerely believed they were doing us a favor by turning humanity into a copy of their civilization. I tried to explain to Zethkur that people value their individuality and don't want to become part of a collective consciousness. It expressed regret about my backward thinking and said that in time, I would understand the benefits of their proposal. After that conversation, I knew I was in mortal danger. Zethkur clearly saw me as an obstacle to their plans. I decided to act quickly and contact journalists or government officials who had not yet been swept up in the cultural exchange program. The next day, I reached out to several independent journalists, but they either didn't believe my story or were already involved with Skelecon projects. One of them even showed me his silver bracelet and said the aliens were our best friends. Then I tried to contact the military, but I was met with disappointment there as well. Colonel Harris, whom I met at the Pentagon, listened to my story with polite interest and then informed me that the military had been collaborating with the Skelecons on strategic planning for several months. He showed me classified documents about joint exercises and technology sharing. According to him, the Skelecons had helped develop new communication and coordination systems among different branches of the armed forces. All the top brass wore the same silver bracelets and considered the aliens the greatest blessing for humanity. I realized the infiltration had gone much deeper than I had thought. The Skelecons weren't conquering Earth by force. They were slowly and methodically integrating into our society, offering useful technologies in exchange for access to human consciousness. Each bracelet was not just a piece of jewelry, but a device for constant connection to their collective network. The people who wore them gradually lost their ability for independent thought and began to perceive the Skelecons' goals as their own. I decided to try to find other people who had not yet fallen under the aliens' influence. Through internet forums, I managed to connect with a small group of similarly suspicious people. We met in an abandoned warehouse outside the city, far from all Skelecon technology. There were only 7 people in our group: me, 2 programmers, a physicist, a doctor, a teacher, and an unemployed guy who just didn't trust anything alien. We called ourselves the Last Free and tried to figure out how to stop the Skelecons' plan. Dr. Smith, the physicist in our group, studied the data I had copied from the company's servers. She discovered that the Skelecons weren't just collecting information about the human brain. They had already begun testing forced neural link technology. The files contained records of experiments on volunteers from the cultural exchange program. People were implanted with microscopic devices in their brains that allowed the Skelecons to directly influence their thoughts and emotions. The subjects lost all memory of the procedure but became completely devoted to the aliens. We realized that time was running out. Soon, the Skelecons would be ready for the mass implementation of their technology. We had to act immediately, while humanity could still be saved. Tom, one of the programmers, suggested we try to hack their orbital stations and erase all the collected data. It was incredibly risky, but we had no other options. We knew that if we didn't stop them now, we would wake up tomorrow in a world where every person was a puppet in the hands of an alien collective consciousness. For the next 3 days, we developed a plan to attack their systems. We had access to some corporate networks through my old passwords, and Tom knew of several vulnerabilities in the Skelecons' communication protocols. The plan was simple: infiltrate their main server, erase all data on human consciousness, and launch a virus that would block their ability to collect new information. We understood that we would become targets for their human agents after this. But there was no other way. On the night between Sunday and Monday, we put the plan into action. Tom and I worked at the computers, trying to break through their defenses while the others kept watch. The hacking process took almost 4 hours, but we managed to gain access to the main database. What we saw there surpassed our worst fears. The Skelecons had detailed consciousness maps of over 100 million people. They knew our fears, desires, memories, and dreams better than we knew them ourselves. Moreover, they had already begun creating artificial copies of human personalities in their computers. These digital duplicates were exact copies of real people, but were completely controlled by the Skelecons. They planned to replace humanity with these obedient simulations. We immediately started deleting the data, but the process was slow due to the enormous volume of information. By morning, we had managed to destroy only about 30% of the files when the system suddenly locked us out. An image of Zethkur appeared on the screens. It said that it had been monitoring our group for a long time and had allowed us to get this far only out of scientific curiosity. According to it, our resistance was predictable and even useful for understanding human psychology. Zethkur explained that the deleted data had already been restored from backups, and our actions had only confirmed the need to accelerate the process of integrating humanity into their collective. It offered us the chance to voluntarily undergo the implantation procedure, promising it would be quick and painless. We refused and tried to leave the warehouse, only to find that the building was surrounded by people wearing silver bracelets. Among them, I recognized my former colleagues, neighbors, and even a few police officers I knew. They all looked at us with the same expression of calm determination. Mark stepped forward and said that resistance was futile. According to him, the Skelecons already controlled all key positions in the government, military, and corporations. The process of integrating humanity into their collective was irreversible, and we could only choose to join voluntarily or be forced. Dr. Smith tried to explain to the crowd that they were being deceived, that the Skelecons wanted to destroy human individuality. But the people in bracelets just shook their heads with pitiful smiles. One of them said that individuality is the source of all suffering, and the collective consciousness would bring eternal happiness. They were surrounding us from all sides, slowly tightening the circle. Each of the people with bracelets held devices that looked like tasers, capable of paralyzing us long enough to implant the control chips. At the last moment, Mary, the teacher, remembered a back exit through the basement. We rushed to the hatch in the floor and jumped one by one into the underground tunnel. We could hear shouts and the sounds of pursuit behind us, but in the darkness of the tunnels, we managed to lose our pursuers. We emerged on the surface several blocks from the warehouse and split into groups of 2 to be less conspicuous. I went with Tom, and we decided to try to reach an abandoned radio station outside the city, where we could broadcast a warning to those who hadn't yet fallen under the Skelecons' influence. Along the way, we saw how much the world had changed in the last few months. People with silver bracelets were everywhere, in stores, on the streets, on public transport. They behaved unusually calm and friendly, but their eyes lacked the spark of individuality that distinguishes a living person from a robot. At the radio station, we managed to start an emergency broadcast. I went on the air and told everyone about the Skelecons' plans, urging people not to trust their technology. But half an hour later, the station was surrounded by agents in bracelets, and we had to run again. For the next few weeks, we hid in forests and abandoned buildings, trying to contact other resistance groups. But there were fewer and fewer such groups. Most people either already wore the bracelets or voluntarily agreed to the implantation after explanatory talks with Skelecon agents. Tom caught a cold and became delirious. During one particularly severe episode, he said he couldn't resist anymore, that the voices in his head were getting louder. I realized they had somehow found a way to influence even those who didn't wear their devices. The next morning, Tom was gone. I found him at the nearest cultural exchange center, standing in line for a silver bracelet. When I tried to talk to him, he looked at me with pity and said that he had finally understood the beauty of the collective consciousness. I was left alone. The other members of our group had either disappeared or voluntarily surrendered to the Skelecons. The world around me had turned into a nightmare where billions of people lived in an artificial happiness, having lost everything that made them human. I understood that resistance was pointless. The Skelecons were too technologically advanced, and their plan was too carefully orchestrated. They had anticipated every possible form of resistance and prepared for it in advance. But I couldn't just give up. Even if I was the last free human on Earth, I had to keep fighting. Not for a victory that was impossible, but for the very idea of human freedom. I decided to try to get to one of their orbital stations. I had a crazy idea. If I could physically get into their main computer, I might be able to cause them serious damage. Of course, it was a suicide mission, but it was better to die free than to live as a puppet. Through a smuggler I knew, I got a spot on a cargo ship delivering supplies to the orbital stations. The ship's captain also wore a bracelet, but his programming was incomplete, and he agreed to take me for a large sum of money, no questions asked. The flight to the Skelecon orbital station took 2 days. During that time, I prepared for the final mission, studying the schematics of their computer systems and preparing virus programs to cause maximum damage to their databases. The orbital station was a huge structure made of the same translucent material as the Skelecon's skin. It pulsed with a soft blue light and resembled a giant living organism floating in space. I managed to sneak onto the station in a cargo container. Inside, everything was permeated with the same biological aesthetic. The walls seemed alive, and the corridors resembled the arteries of some cosmic creature. I moved through the station, using the schematics I had studied on Earth. The Skelecons didn't expect humans to infiltrate their ships, so security was minimal. Most of them were too busy analyzing the data from Earth. Finally, I reached the main computer center. It was a huge spherical room, its walls covered with thousands of screens showing various aspects of human life. I saw city streets, the interiors of houses, even the dreams of people sleeping in their beds. In the center of the room was a massive biological computer that looked like a giant brain made of crystal and light. This was the heart of their operation to control humanity. I connected my portable computer to their system and began uploading the virus programs. The process was slow, but I watched as the screens began to flicker and go dark one by one. The data on human consciousness was being erased, and the control systems were failing. Suddenly, Zeth entered the room. It didn't look surprised or angry. On the contrary, in its glowing eyes, I saw something akin to admiration. It said that my journey to the orbital station had been predicted by their analytical systems with a 97% probability. My psychological profile indicated that this was exactly how I would react to a hopeless situation. Zeth explained that my actions were part of a final experiment. They wanted to study the extreme forms of human resistance to ensure their control system could handle any unforeseen circumstances. Moreover, it informed me that the viruses I had uploaded into their system were actually designed by them. My attempt at sabotage had only helped them test their defense mechanisms and improve their network security. I realized that from the very beginning, I had been a pawn in their game. Even my resistance had been predicted and used for their purposes. Humanity had lost not only the war, but the very ability to genuinely resist. Zeth offered me a final choice. I could agree to voluntary integration into their collective and retain my personality as a separate element of their consciousness. Or they would forcibly erase my individuality and turn me into one of their faceless drones. I chose a third option. Pulling out an explosive charge I had prepared, I threatened to blow up the entire computer center along with myself. Of course, this wouldn't stop their plans, but it would at least cause them temporary damage. Zeth looked at me with something resembling sadness. It said that this reaction had also been predicted, and activating the explosive would change nothing. Their technology allowed for the instantaneous restoration of any damaged systems. But then it added something unexpected. It said that my persistent resistance had made them reconsider some aspects of their plans. Perhaps the complete eradication of human individuality was not the best solution. Zeth explained that the Skelecons had concluded that the diversity of consciousness in the galaxy was valuable. The collective mind of their race had achieved technical perfection, but had lost the capacity for creativity and innovation. Human individuality could bring new ideas to their civilization. It proposed a compromise. Instead of fully integrating humanity into their collective, the Skelecons would create a hybrid system. People would retain their individuality, but would gain access to the collective knowledge and capabilities of their race. It wasn't the outcome I had hoped for, but it was better than the complete enslavement of humanity. I agreed to be the first volunteer for this experiment, on the condition that other people would have the right to choose. The procedure was surprisingly painless. A tiny device was implanted in my brain that allowed me to connect to the Skelecon network at will. I could remain fully human or temporarily become part of their collective consciousness. When I first connected to their network, I felt an incredible expansion of consciousness. I could access the knowledge of thousands of civilizations, understand the laws of the universe that humanity had not yet discovered. But at the same time, I remained myself, with all my human emotions and memories, and the following months were spent in negotiations between representatives of humanity and the Skelecons. Many people initially refused the proposed hybrid system, but gradually, more and more volunteers agreed to the implantation. The world changed drastically, but not in the way I had feared. People retained their humanity, but gained access to technologies and knowledge they could only have dreamed of before. Diseases were conquered, hunger was eradicated, and wars became impossible thanks to mutual understanding on the deepest level. Of course, not everything was perfect. Some people abused the new opportunities, while others became addicted to the collective consciousness. But overall, humanity adapted to the new reality better than anyone had expected. I often think about what would have happened if I hadn't tried to resist the Skelecons' plans. Perhaps humanity would have indeed lost its individuality forever. Or maybe the Skelecons would have reached the same compromise on their own, just later. Now I work as a translator between different civilizations on the Galactic Council. My unique perspective as a human who remembers the time before contact with aliens makes me a valuable mediator in diplomatic negotiations. Sometimes I disconnect from the collective network and just sit in silence, enjoying my own thoughts. In those moments, I realize that we didn't lose the war for humanity. We just changed the rules of the game. Recently, I met a young girl who was born after the integration. She asked me what it was like to be completely disconnected from the collective consciousness. I tried to explain to her the feeling of loneliness and isolation that was once the norm for people. She couldn't understand how we survived without constant access to the knowledge and emotions of other people. To her, the idea of being locked inside one's own head seemed terrifying, like living in solitary confinement. I told her about the beauty of individual discovery, the joy of finding a solution to a problem on your own, the warmth of personal relationships that aren't shared with billions of other minds. She listened with curiosity, like children listen to fairy tales about distant times. Then she connected to the archives and, in a few seconds, studied the entire history of humanity before contact with the aliens. Afterward, she said she understood my point of view, but still preferred the modern world. I can't say she's wrong. The new generation of humans is free from many of the problems that tormented us before. Depression, misunderstanding, fear of death, limited knowledge. They live in a world of endless possibilities and deep mutual understanding. But sometimes I feel that something important was lost in the process of evolution. Maybe it's just the nostalgia of an old man who remembers different times. Or maybe there really is something valuable in that imperfect, yet genuinely human way of existence. Last week, I received a message from Zeth Kor. It informed me that their race has also changed thanks to contact with humanity. For the first time in thousands of years, some skelecons have begun experimenting with individual consciousness, temporarily disconnecting from the collective network. These hermits, as they are called, have started to create art, write poetry, and even fall in love. All the things their race once considered primitive human weaknesses. Zeth Kor admitted that it sometimes disconnects from the collective itself to feel something akin to loneliness. It said that the exchange between our civilizations turned out to be mutually beneficial in ways no one could have foreseen. The skelecons gained a creative spark and emotional depth, while humans gained technological capabilities and cosmic understanding. But the most interesting discovery happened on the other side of the galaxy. A race of beings was found there that had evolved in a completely different way. They had never known a collective consciousness, nor did they have individuality in the human sense. These beings, whom we named the Echo Splitters, lived in a state of constant consciousness division. Each of them could simultaneously be several different personalities with different memories, goals, and emotions. For them, the concept of a single self was as alien as the collective consciousness was to us. The Galactic Council decided to organize a three-way cultural exchange between humans, skelecons, and Echo Splitters. The goal was to study all possible forms of consciousness and create even more advanced hybrid systems. I became one of the coordinators of this project. My task was to help representatives of different races understand each other, despite their fundamentally different ways of perceiving reality. The first meeting was interesting. The skelecons tried to connect the Echo Splitters to their collective network, but their divided consciousness simply couldn't synchronize with the single stream of thought. And the Echo Splitters couldn't understand how one could have only one personality in one's head. Humans turned out to be a kind of mediator in this dialogue. Our capacity for individual thought helped us understand the Echo Splitters, and our experience with the skelecons' collective consciousness gave us the tools to communicate with them. In the process of these negotiations, I realized something important. Consciousness is not just a way of processing information, but a fundamental characteristic of life in the universe. Each race develops its own unique approach to perceiving reality, and all these approaches have their value. Humans bring creativity and emotional depth. Skelecons provide technological power and logical perfection. Echo Splitters offer flexibility of thought and the ability to see problems from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Working with representatives of all three races, I began to experiment with new forms of consciousness. Using Skelecon technology and the division techniques of the Echo Splitters, I was able to create temporary copies of my personality to solve complex problems. It was an incredible feeling. To converse with myself, yet each copy had its own view of the problem and its own emotions. We could argue, agree, even conflict with each other, and then merge our conclusions into a single solution. Of course, such experiments were dangerous. A few times, I nearly lost control of the copies, and they began to develop independently of the original personality. But with each experience, I learned to better manage the process of consciousness division and fusion. These skills proved incredibly useful in my diplomatic work. I could literally put myself in the shoes of representatives of other races by creating a copy of my consciousness with their perceptual traits. This allowed me to find compromises in the most difficult negotiations. One of the most challenging cases was an attempt to resolve a conflict between two colonies of echo splitters. The problem was that one colony consisted of beings with two personalities in each body, while the other consisted of those who had up to 10 different personalities. The doubles considered the multiples to be unstable and dangerous to society. The multiples, in turn, accused the doubles of being primitive and incapable of complex thought. The conflict had escalated to the point where both sides were preparing for war. I created several copies of my consciousness, one with a dual personality, another with multiple. By spending months in a state of divided consciousness, I was able to understand the perspectives of both sides of the conflict. The doubles were indeed more emotionally stable, but their thinking was less flexible. The multiples possessed incredible creativity and multitasking abilities, but often suffered from internal conflicts between their different personalities. In the end, I managed to propose a solution that satisfied both sides. A hybrid type of consciousness was created that allowed beings to temporarily increase or decrease the number of personalities depending on the situation. The success of this mission earned me recognition in the galactic community. I began to be invited to resolve the most complex interracial conflicts. Each new case required experiments with different forms of consciousness. I worked with a race of silicon-based beings who thought at the speed of geological processes. A single thought of theirs could last for years, and solving a simple problem took decades. To communicate with them, I had to create a copy of my consciousness slowed down 1,000 times. There was also the opposite situation with energy beings whose consciousness worked at the speed of light. They could live an entire lifetime in the time it took me to utter a single syllable. Communicating with them required creating an accelerated copy of my mind. Each such experience expanded my understanding of the nature of consciousness and reality. I began to see the universe not as a physical space filled with matter, but as an infinite variety of different ways of perceiving existence. But the most important discovery awaited me while working with an ancient race we called the First Ones. They had existed for billions of years and were among the creators of many forms of life in the galaxy, including the ancestors of humanity. The First Ones possessed the ability to directly influence the structure of reality with the power of their thoughts. They didn't use technology in the conventional sense. Their consciousness itself was the tool for changing the physical laws of the universe. In a conversation with one of their representatives, I learned an amazing truth. According to them, our entire reality was the result of a collective dream of a vast cosmic being. The galaxies, stars, planets, all forms of life. These were the thoughts and dreams of this sleeping titan. The First Ones explained that the different forms of consciousness that evolve in the universe are actually the cosmic being's attempts to understand itself through a multitude of different perspectives. Each intelligent race represents a distinct aspect of its personality. Humans embody the creative and emotional aspects. Skelecons represent logic and order. Echo splitters symbolize flexibility and adaptability. All other races also have their roles in this cosmic self-discovery. When I asked what would happen if the cosmic being woke up, the First One replied that no one knew. Perhaps all of reality would vanish, just as a dream vanishes upon waking. Or maybe it would transform into something entirely different. This information forced me to reevaluate my entire life experience. Perhaps my struggle against the Skelecons, our evolution as a species, all the conflicts and reconciliations between different races, all of it was part of the cosmic mind's process of self-discovery. I realized that every consciousness in the universe plays an important role in this process. There is no right or wrong way to think or exist. All forms of consciousness are valuable because each adds a new facet to the understanding of reality. This realization changed my approach to diplomatic work. Instead of trying to find compromises between different points of view, I began to help races understand how their unique features complement the overall picture of cosmic existence. The results were astonishing. Conflicts that seemed unsolvable suddenly found resolutions when the parties realized their complementary roles in the grand scheme of things. Instead of fighting for dominance, different races began to collaborate to create a more complete understanding of reality. Now, decades after that terrible morning when I woke up with someone else's memories, I can say that the journey was worth it. Yes, humanity has changed drastically, and many things we once valued have been lost forever. But in return, we received something incredible. The opportunity to become part of a cosmic process of self-discovery that is larger than any single civilization or even galaxy. We have gained a perspective that surpasses our wildest dreams. And yet, When I sit in my home on the orbital station in the evenings and look at the stars, I sometimes miss the times when I was just a human with simple human problems. Perhaps that too is part of the cosmic plan, to retain the memory of what we were, to better understand what we have become. In the end, if the entire universe is indeed the dream of a cosmic being, then our task is to make that dream as rich and interesting as possible. And for that, we need all possible forms of consciousness, all ways of perceiving reality, all perspectives on existence. Even my resistance to the Skelecon's plans was an important part of this process. Without conflict, there would be no development. Without challenges, there would be no growth. Every struggle, every defeat, every victory added new colors to the palette of cosmic self-discovery. This morning, I received a message about a new race discovered in a distant galaxy. They possess a form of consciousness that no one has ever encountered before, the ability to think backward in time. For them, the future is the past, and the past is the future. Soon, a new mission awaits me. New experiments with consciousness, new discoveries about the nature of reality. And I eagerly await this challenge, because each new understanding brings us closer to the awakening of that cosmic being whose dreams we all are. Or maybe the goal isn't to wake it up, but to help it have brighter and more interesting dreams. In any case, this journey continues, and I'm happy to be a part of it.